Welcome to the Magical Salon, where two regular people, Amanda and James, explore mystical ideas and big questions. From books to pop culture, if it's a doorway to something deeper, we're probably into it. We're not experts, and maybe you aren't either, but that's kind of the point.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Magical Salon. I am your host, James, joined by...
And I'm Amanda, your spiritual seeker.
Okay. So this week, we are going to be diving into gnosis as a concept. Gnosis is a term that has kind of been around for a while. So if you're familiar with like historical religion and like theology...
Nobody is.
Okay, well then I've got some good stuff for you then. So there's something called Gnosticism, which I'm not sure if I would call it a religion per se, but it's like some old school mysticism basically. And it was from the 1st and 3rd century is when it was kind of big. It originated from Christianity, Judaism, Platonism, which is interesting because Plato is that's what it's referencing in this case, and Zoroastrianism, which I'm not super familiar with, other than I know people say it's like one of the oldest religions. So that's kind of just some background on the term and where it originated from. Now, the word gnosis, though, itself, that's actually a Greek word, which I thought was interesting. And it means essentially knowledge. But it's not intellectual understanding, like book knowledge. It's direct experiential insight into the divine or the ultimate reality. That's, at a very high level, the term we're talking about. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts? I know I kind of threw a lot at you, but when did you first hear of the word gnosis? What do you think of when you hear gnosis?
Honestly, I don't know when I first heard it. It's like one of those things that I'm sure I was hearing the word a long time before I finally realized what it was or what it was referring to, which I think a lot of things are kind of like that. I think it's good that we're finally doing an episode on gnosis because through this episode, I think and hope that it will help further elucidate our prior comments about like transcending, like what does that mean? And I think gnosis for me, well, I don't know, maybe we'll get into this, but is gnosis a state that you are like always in or that you can sometimes go in, or does it refer to knowledge that you've received through like a direct revelation capacity?
That's where gnosis is kind of getting into like, in some ways, spiritual will or like devotion, or how well can you keep up whatever practice you're striving for. To backtrack a little, we're going to use the book Liber Null and Psychonaut as kind of the basis for this discussion, which is written by Peter Carroll. It's a very prominent book relating to chaos magic, which that could be an entire episode on its own. But he has a part in here where he specifically discusses the term gnosis. And in a modern magical context, I think this is what kind of popularized it and is probably why we have heard of it, whether it's from this book or just he kind of popularized it maybe 60s, 70s, and then it kind of spurred a movement. So he says, altered states of consciousness are the key to magical powers. The particular state of mind required has a name in every tradition, no mind. He's referring to gnosis in this capacity. But think of what we've discussed on previous episodes, no mind, wu wei, like doing without doing. He's essentially talking about the same thing. So there's just a lot of looping back to these terms that we've discussed before. He kind of breaks it down further by saying that stopping the internal dialogue and becoming nothing, or ein in Jewish mysticism, like the Ein Sof. Another way of looking at it is samadhi, which is a Hindu or Buddhist term. Those are essentially, it's a state of profound meditative consciousness. That's what samadhi means. And it leads to a state of profound calm, spiritual ecstasy, and liberation. Gnosis and samadhi, in some way he's equating the two, which is interesting because gnosis is the magical version. I would say samadhi, enlightenment, is the religious interpretation. They're describing the same mental state.
I guess I would first say that, because you mentioned Jewish mysticism, I think, but I would just say mysticism in general is deeply tied to gnosis, because as I think we said before, gnosis is uniquely focused on direct experience with God. Like, no matter how you're perceiving God or how you believe that, it's still about direct contact, right? Yeah, it's interesting because, like, if you're in a state of gnosis, you are closest to God because you are kind of like sitting there with God in a way. It kind of reminds me of Saint Teresa of Avila and her idea of like the interior castle, where she was a Christian mystic, specifically a Catholic mystic, and she like had this idea of the interior castle where you go within to find God, and it's kind of conceptualized as a giant castle. And as you go through the 7 chambers, once you get to the last chamber, the innermost chamber, then you're just kind of sitting there in loving awareness with God. So it's interesting because you think like, okay, if I'm closest to God during gnosis, what am I going to do with that? Am I going to meditate? Am I just going to be to our prior conversation? Or am I going to practice magic?
That is interesting. Some people that have been associated with the term gnosis, like occultist wise as well. Aleister Crowley was big on gnosis
Who we mention like every episode.
because he's very important in the world of magic, I would say. For good or bad, he did a lot to bring awareness and kind of sharing the secrets, so to speak, of some of these mystical schools that have been around for thousands of years but weren't readily accessible. And he was one of the first people kind of around during the printing press kind of boom, the late 1800s, early 1900s. He did a lot of traveling right when you were kind of able to do that. But anyway, so he's very popular with the term. And then Austin Osman Spare, who we could do an episode on him. He's lesser known, but very important, specifically relating to sigils and sigil magic, but he was a very famous painter, actually. Also, just touch on one other thing that I thought was interesting about the term gnosis before we delve into the magical side of it. Those are some of the occultists that are linked with it, and they viewed gnosis as a trance or ecstatic rapture. Another way of looking at it would be like, to do magic, you need to attain a state of gnosis for the magic to work. So essentially, if you do all these magical rituals, but you're not in gnosis, you're not focused on your ultimate objective, it will not work. It doesn't matter if you do all of the pageantry and incense and everything. You have to be internally aligned as well.
I guess as I understand it, since it's got an element of no mind, you're not really meant to be thinking about whatever intention it is during the ceremony that you're doing, like whatever your magical purpose may be. Like, let's say you want to increase your wealth. I kind of got the impression, or maybe this is only true of sigils, that you're not meant to be like, it's almost like you're meant to be having thought about it so much that when you go into gnosis, it's operating on an unconscious level. And because you've combined that unconscious intent with gnosis, those two things allow it to happen in the real world.
Right. That's a good point. And I think that the term subconscious, if we use Jung, who we'll need to do an episode on, but I've read some of his stuff, but I would not call myself an expert by any means. But he did a lot to describe kind of the subconscious and then your conscious mind. And the idea is that gnosis is kind of aligning the two. It's tricky to think of like, what is the subconscious? Because it's like, you mean I'm thinking things that I'm not aware of? But it's like, kind of, yeah. Like if you have ulterior motives, or maybe you do things, but you never think of why you do them. It could be like, oh, this happened when I was a kid, so now I always look 3 times before I cross the street. But I think that's kind of the subconscious, the things that you cannot express with your rational mind.
Yeah, I mean, I guess before we go further, so I'd like to delve into this concept of spiritual ecstasy because it comes up when you read about saints or people that lived like during Teresa's time period, like, I don't know, like the 1500s, let's just say. Like that kind of time period, right? You have like people who are really religious are seeking and also being in spiritual ecstasy. So I guess the question is, what really is that? Because that's not really how I understand gnosis. Like, I get that when you go into gnosis, you finally kind of understand that there is an all, and the divine spark in you is the same as like the divine all around you, which I guess could provoke a sort of ecstasy in you. But like, I've never really experienced that, nor have I seen anyone like in the modern age really talk about that, other than like when people talk about going on mushroom journeys, but they don't really describe it as ecstasy. It's more like I understood something on such a deep and profound level, but it doesn't provoke ecstasy necessarily.
I don't know if the ecstasy that you experience, it's not the kind of ecstasy where you're like jubilant, I don't think, and like jumping around and giddy with excitement. Like, I think it's a bit more subtle than that.
So then how can it be ecstasy? Because isn't ecstasy like, I don't know, that's just not how I identify ecstasy as.
Yeah, that's because even drugs, like there's a drug called ecstasy, and whenever I think of it and how it's presented in movies, people are like tripping balls out of their minds and they're like, whoa. But you don't think of, from a spiritual perspective, that's not at all aligned with what I would envision like a monk attaining ecstasy to look like. I think there's kind of a difference there because that kind of talks about Peter Carroll's book again, then, Liber Null, to loop back. He basically says there's two ways that you can get into gnosis. There's two methods. There's the inhibitory method and the excitatory method, or modes. So inhibitory, it's what it says. And think of asceticism, restricting stuff, not thinking about things, blocking yourself out to the external world so you can focus your concentration internally on a very specific thought or idea. He gives an example of the death posture, which is extreme, but like if you literally just cover your eyes, ears, nose, don't breathe, eventually like you're not going to be thinking about anything because you're just going to become unconscious eventually. Or before you become unconscious, your body will override your thought and you'll be like, and he says that's a way you could attain gnosis, which is kind of an odd thought. Then there's magical trances, but from asceticism specifically, sleeplessness, fasting, exhaustion. That's very common in religious practice.
Well, and they used to do a lot of like self-flagellation, specifically like, I mean, again, my reference point is always Catholicism. Like I mean, they never really talked about it, but you would see things, even in movies, where there'd be like a priest who was like self-flagellating. And yeah, the idea is that through the pain, it can help you get closer to God.
And he lists that. That's the excitatory method from him because you're doing something to your body to feel something. So yeah, like emotional arousal would be considered an excitatory method from him. Pain and torture, flagellation, dancing and drumming, which is a more positive way of looking at it because most of these options aren't really exciting to think about. Chanting. And then there's obviously drugs. Would alcohol be considered a pathway to achieving gnosis then? It's a drug, right?
Alcohol is not the best. If you can do some mind altering, then that allows you to obtain certain states of consciousness. So you would probably turn to something like mushrooms or LSD or even weed.
Well, so that's interesting because you mentioned states of consciousness, which that's what gnosis is, right? You're trying to get to a different state of consciousness than your base normal consciousness, let's call it. There's also something called Hermeticism, which is also old. It talks about gnosis as well as being the union with divine intelligence. And essentially they basically said, the Hermeticists, that magicians don't control reality. Like, it's not like, oh, I just believe in something and then it magically appears, but instead that you try to harmonize with the Tao or with the cosmic soup or whatever. Like, you try to become aligned with the natural flow of things to become in gnosis, which is funny because I don't think of doing drugs or any of those as helping you.
The methods that he suggested for the most part do not indicate that. Self-flagellation, pretending to die, like other, like, I don't know. I feel like there are many ways to get there, and I do not believe that you need to engage in that sort of thing, which is antithetical to, again, I'm always railing on these Western magicians, but I feel like they just want to do this like crazy stuff to seem like super out there and like for people to talk about them and how crazy they are and stuff. But it's like, I really don't think that that is necessary. There's almost like an element of showmanship to it.
There is, right? Like Crowley is trying to be shocking almost. He's kind of the magical shock jock. Like if you think of like Howard Stern or whatever, like they got famous for just being offensive on the radio.
He's trying to offend you. And if you are offended, he views that as a success. But if you read these magical books, they do suggest crazy things. They're like, oh, well, the magician must do everything under the sun in order to truly understand. And it's like, no, like that's not true.
Gnosticism, it basically said that gnosis is how you find salvation. And going back to the idea of gnosis as knowledge, it was to be saved in Gnosticism isn't about, in Christianity, you ask for forgiveness for your sins, and then that's how you are saved, get into heaven. In Gnosticism, the goal in salvation is from waking up. So realizing and remembering your divine origin, which you could also say Christianity, oh, you're all children of God, or you're a light being, and like some hippie circles, that's a big thing.
But don't you feel that that's different? You are all children of God is a totally different sentiment than you are God or you are all part of one thing.
I'm thinking from a divine origin perspective, though. It's like you are forgetting where you come from, basically. If you are a child of God, you are a child of God at that point. If you truly believe in God, it's like, wow, I have the creator in me then. I am of the creator. These people and religions of all kinds from all over the world throughout history have done these methods. They wouldn't be doing it for no reason if it didn't do something. Nobody's going to sit there and self-flagellate if it must be doing something that they're seeking.
The self-flagellation example raises an interesting question, which is, why are you really doing this? Are you really doing this to achieve gnosis? Or are you doing this to punish yourself for sins or for being evil or for bad behavior? And I feel like, it's kind of a slippery slope in a lot of ways.
Peter Carroll again. He's talking about a lot of religious practices in the magical context. So he's almost he's basically saying it works religiously, but you can use it for magic where you're not devoting the practice to a god.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's like the whole thing that magic is based off of. Like, magic is based off of religion at the end of the day. Just think about like the idea of a black mass. You're literally inverting a Catholic mass or a Christian mass because you know that power resides there in those actions and those things, and it also has a long historical tradition, so it's even more powerful because of that. And you have like magicians in these ceremonies using the names of God, like that kind of thing. It's because they know there's power there. But if there were no religion, then what would you draw on? So I don't know. It's kind of a codependent relationship in my mind.
From a gnosis perspective, then, do you think you've experienced states of gnosis? How would you describe it then? What is the experience like? And how did you get there?
I mean, it's hard to explain other than I've never been like one of those like desensitization chambers, but it kind of feels like what I imagine that is like. There's no thought. There's no feeling really either because there's no thought. There's just being. So you're there, but you don't even like feel like you're there.
So do you feel like you're in your body or you're like observing yourself?
I'm not looking at myself, but I'm also not really myself at the same time. I like don't exist because I'm being at such a high level. It's kind of how I would describe it.
So how do you get to these states where you're so invested in being then?
Well, writing can help me get there to some extent, but sometimes when I'm writing, even though I'm mindless, I'm wu-weiing, I'm still thinking, obviously, because I'm writing. But I mean, the best example that I can think of, just for me personally, which won't really make sense for the listener because they weren't there, but when I went on a work trip to DC earlier this year, and I was just on the plane, sitting in my aisle seat. I had my noise canceling headphones with my transcending playlist. So music is definitely something that helps me get there. And that was all I was doing. I was just listening to the music, and then I was able to just sort of go somewhere else, I guess, but also not at the same time. Just not exist for a brief span of time. And then I like came back to myself. That's so I've never like been able to do it for that long. I mean, have you ever done it?
I would say yes. Sometimes specifically for me, like if I would do like qigong or some meditations. Meditation is the most consistent way that you can achieve a state of gnosis.
What's an example of you going into gnosis, and how would you describe it?
The state of no mind I like as a phrase, but I think that people, it's like, well, what are you even talking about?
But that's the point. The point is, if you've never experienced it, it is hard to comprehend. Because think about how much of your life you're always thinking and thinking and thinking and feeling, and there's just like all this physicality, and you're so in your head. If you're able to escape that, even for 1 second, you remember it, right? Like that's kind of the idea.
That's a good point. So I like what you said. I think when I have entered states of gnosis, I didn't realize it until after the fact. So for instance, maybe I was like writing something or reading something or doing a meditation. And then all of a sudden I look at the clock and it's, oh my goodness, I was doing that for 2 hours. I just was meaning to write down like one little note to myself. And then all of a sudden I had this huge brain dump of just random stuff where it's like, I don't know what I'm getting this from, but I'm going to keep going with it. Or a meditation where you're really into it. I've had meditations where it's brutal, right? Like every minute I'm like opening my eyes a little bit and peeking at the clock and I'm like, ugh.
15 more minutes still.
And then there's also some where it's like you sit down, close your eyes, and then it seems like 1 second later your alarm's going off because you're done.
Practice is an essential element of, if you want to go into gnosis, either ever or more than once, I think practice is an element, but I think the most important part is getting rid of expectation. It's kind of like what you said. If you, like every time you went into gnosis, and that's also been true for me, I've never been trying to go into it. I just have. And then afterward, I was like, that's what I was doing. That's what I was experiencing. So, I mean, if you have a practice of trying to go into gnosis every day, you should have the expectation maybe that you won't, or you'll just keep your mind open and whatever will happen will happen. And that's probably the best way to do it, because if you try, like trying too hard will make it impossible for you to do it, because that's too much thinking, right? And you cannot be thinking that hard. There's like an element of surrender, I feel like, but if you are like too much in your head, even just thinking about, oh, I'm going to try and surrender right now. No, right now I'm going to try and surrender. Like that's thinking, so you can't do it.
It kind of reminds me of something from the Psychick Bible, which is by the Temple of Psychic Youth. They have a section on not doing, which again, wu wei, not doing, no mind, the void, all these different terms are touching on the same thing. And in this book, they said not doing involves maximal psychic force and minimal physical exertion, which to me is, yeah, like it's concentration, it's focus, it's meditation. So if you are really concentrating and invested in a project or a problem you're trying to solve, you can go into gnosis. It's narrow-minded. It's like one-pointedness.
It's kind of like my writing example. Like, I feel like that's wu-weiing, but I don't know that I would consider it gnosis per se, which I don't know. I mean, maybe that doesn't even need to be a distinction. But I was actually kind of thinking, like, earlier this morning when I went running, I think I did actually achieve gnosis. And again, I wasn't trying to. So I feel like the trick is to find what works for you. Like for me, I'm not really a big meditator. It's never really resonated with me. I've always just found it like I'm fighting my mind. For me, running, at some point, my mind does still. And sometimes it gets very still, like this morning. And I don't know, like absolute stillness. If you think of like a pond, no ripples, that's my mind. That's gnosis, right? Like in my mind it is.
It's again going back to, it's easy to say, it is very hard to do. You can't buy gnosis. You can't buy a pill. You can't buy a course. It's an internal knowing which is what all of these religions and all these like old mystical schools talked about too. It's internal. Like you have to do the work yourself. Like you can read a book about it, you can listen to people talk about it, but if you don't spend the time to try and achieve it or get immersed in something, ultimately it's just book smarts. Like you can know about it, but you've never experienced it.
In French, which I took in high school and 1 year in college, in French there's 2 verbs that mean to know. There's connaître and savoir. So savoir is like, I know something like from a fact-based perspective. I know how tall the Eiffel Tower is, for example, or how many gallons of gas go in my car. Whereas connaître is like, I know something on a personal level. Like I know you as a person. I know that place because I've been there, not just I know that place exists. And I think that's kind of what gnosis is getting at. That's direct revelation. It's one thing to know it and another to experience it.
It's almost knowing versus understanding then. Like I could know about something but still not understand it.
The thing with gnosis though, like it's not always like something's being imparted to you, right?
Being like the divine is how you understand the divine. The idea of alchemy is all of the macrocosmic elements are also present within you. So the weekly wisdom is coming from a book called Advanced Magick for Beginners. So it's kind of an oxymoron by Chapman. Basically, he says what occurs here in gnosis is exactly the same as what occurs during sympathetic magic. Namely, you decide what an experience will mean, then you undergo that experience.
It's kind of reminding me of something that I saw somewhere recently where it was basically just this person talking about if you're like a very peaceful person and you have a lot of inner peace and one thing can happen that disrupts it, do you have any peace at all, or are you just really good at controlling things in your life? And I think that's an interesting perspective because it's so easy to decide, oh, I'm going to go... Even just something simple. Oh, I'm going to go get a coffee this morning from the shop down the street from me. And that's going to be a good experience. But then I get in my car, it doesn't start. It's like, how do I react to that? Am I mad that the experience is ruined? Or do I pivot and still make it into something? I mean, I saw another thing and it was talking about, it was like, if you cannot do the dishes joyfully, you cannot do anything joyfully because it's ultimately about being present. If I'm pissed off that I have to do the dishes and I cannot do that joyfully and I'm thinking about that, even if I'm thinking about, oh, in 10 minutes when I'm done with these dishes, then I could be at peace. Then when I'm so-called in my moments where I should be at peace, I might be thinking about the next thing still and I'm still not able to just be present.
Yeah, we gave you a lot of options. I'd recommend not starting with most of the ones that were listed.
Yeah, I'd recommend something tame like running or music or meditating.
Tune in next week. Be sure to like and subscribe. Follow us on all of the platforms that exist.
Bye.